As we showed in Architects of Control, we had a clip on Elvis and the decline and how it paralleled the movement of the sun into the underworld. I mean, he even wore the symbol of the sun, and many of the references that he made, which are rather cryptic actually, once you understood their esoteric significance, then you realize what I'm talking about. But this was even picked up officially by the great art critic and literary critic Camille Paglia, anyone who's read her works or her essays. And these are expert symbolists. She had already picked up on this motif of the tie-in to the sun cult and the symbolism of the sun. But there's many, many famous people whose daughters or sons, for some strange reason, have committed suicide. Here's a short list. You notice Andrew Koenig, the son of Walter Koenig from Star Trek, and other famous names. I put in parentheses there that some of these people are actually attached to Andy Warhol's weird group, and also some to the Playboy and Penthouse franchises, you see. But each one, I listed these particular ones because they're of great interest ritualistically. If you go onto Wikipedia or go to the net and look up these names, you will find very suggestive information about their deaths. This one also is particularly interesting. Margot Hemingway, the granddaughter of Ernest Hemingway, very much caught up in that whole celebrity pigsty. And her cousin runs a psychic hotline, which again, taken individually is not that interesting, but taken collectively, you start seeing a pattern of people involved with the spiritualist movement being an offshoot of the Fabian Society. And in fact, when she started to sort of go a bit crazy, she reported that, she had been abused by her godfather. And again, her family doesn't believe that it was a suicide. Here we have Zachary Selig. They were friends, by the way. Margot Hemingway were very close friends with this guy. And he is one loony guy. If you read up on his... this is his personal logo, by the way. An Egyptian. He's Jewish, but this is an Egyptian eagle or vulture, depending on which tradition you're coming from, and it uses the pyramid. And anyone who knows that the original Judites were very much connected to the Atenists, then these kinds of strange symbolism can be understood. Now this guy, Selig, was actually born in South America, and he professes to be in direct contact with Mexican priests. That's all he'll say about it. And he's in with all the other larger, big Jewish fashion head honchos. Deeply involved in the occult, openly so. House full of weird relics and symbolism, and he's known to have given readings and spiritual advice to many celebrities. So another one of these bizarre, creepy figures to watch out for. We know, of course, about the condition of Michael Jackson, his father's bizarre connections to strange organizations. And you have to feel sorry, but at the same time you have to just question, these are not individual cases, you know. And then, what are their allegiances? Were they themselves abused from childhood so that they go on until the point comes where their mind control breaks down? Are they talented children, these sort of Dionysian children who have special talents, special dates of birth, that these astrological types are aware of, you see? This, again, is going back to how I got into this myself. I started to understand that this astrological sidereal information was being used by the establishment. And then they know that they can put these people on the world stage because they serve an iconic purpose, an archetypal iconic purpose. Recently we heard about Marie Osmond's son, strange death there. We have the suicide of the famous lawyer. Absolutely bizarre. Again, completely out of character. He was the husband of the Dukes of Hazzard pinup, Catherine Bach. His name was Peter Lopez. Found dead on his own lawn with a gunshot wound to the head. Again, that very day he'd been chatting very gregariously to friends. So it totally took everybody by surprise. High-level lawyer. We got to think about, like it says in the Brotherhood of the Bell, what happens if you're going to blow the whistle? What happens if you have a particular conflict with a fellow colleague or worker and they want to get rid of you? Doesn't mean it's always ritualistic, but we have to take each of these cases separately and look at these other elements. This one is obviously bizarre, no different than the recent Polish plane crash with Beverly Eckhart, who dies in 2009, few days after meeting Obama. Why? Because she's pushing for disclosure on 9/11. She's too much of a threat, so suddenly she's done away with. There's a fellow who went around to film the Polish plane crash suddenly is stabbed to death in the hotel literally days after the incident because he's the one who's got the footage of the plane crash. Yeah, that's a coincidence. But even then, given time, like we saw the one with Peg Entwistle that I mentioned last time, 20 years later, 30 years later, in some cases 40 years later, somebody on their deathbed makes a confession and says, well, let me tell you something that's been on my mind for a long time. And that's what's just happened now with the Brian Jones death, that habitually has been put before us as just an accident. But in fact now the truth is starting to come out, that there was a murder involved here and a police cover-up involved in the death of Brian Jones, the blonde, the only blonde member of the Rolling Stones. And as Constantine points out, very similar events, bizarre events surrounding the death of Jimi Hendrix. And always, not always, but in the vast majority of cases, again, around these sort of iconic figures, you have this totemic blonde female, in this case Marianne Faithfull, was very in with the Rolling Stones, and we saw how elite her background was. We have Anita Pallenberg from Sweden, who was not only friends with Jagger, but was at one time, I think, married to Keith Richards, and was a very intimate friend with all of the Rolling Stones. In fact, here she is with Brian Jones. She appeared in the bizarre movie The Performance, which has also ritualistic elements in it. Interestingly, she has a separate controversy because a young man was allegedly had committed suicide in her bedroom. If you go back and look into her, type her name into the internet, you'll find that controversy, that this guy, this young man, had blown his own brains out in her bed. And of course it was all covered up as just a suicide and some sort of depressed teen incident, nothing to do with her. She was exonerated. It has astrological aspects to it, the balancing. Aleister Crowley had also mentioned this about the feminine counterpart to the magician, and often that takes on a physical form. His companion was known as the Scarlet Woman, and it was a noted thing at the time that he was going around with these females that in the magical ritual were meant to balance or in some way counterpoint the personality of the male. But of course we're dealing here with androgyny, like we saw in some of the ads when we first met in March. The advertisements are very much into the concept of androgyny, and that has many elements as part of the ritual. But again, even with the death of Sid Vicious, you have the blonde female in proximity. With OJ, you have the blonde female very much tied into the not only drug network but the underworld. She was very much involved in the underworld, the sinister underworld of the high-class prostitution. Of course, this never came out officially, but you should dig deep and find she was very close friends with Faye Resnick and a lot of shady drug-dealing, pornographic people in the underworld in LA who were protecting her. And you still find the motif today, in recent times. Here we have Agnes Dane and Albert Hammond Jr. So it's still something that goes on today. There's a very, what I consider, sinister image, by the way, of Sasha Pivovarov with George Harrison. Note that the pose is ritualistic. That's stylized. That's not natural. That's made for camera. The supine, lethargic pose of the male, and the appears to be protecting spirit guardian of the female, is an image that I can show you going back to ancient Egypt, as a matter of fact. And of course, a little time ago, we had the murder of Gianni Versace. It's important to notice these names because, as I said, these people, it's not just that they're lone people. You see, these are part of this international syndicate of families that are very much involved in the alcohol purveyance and drug purveyance, the opium from years ago, tied very deeply into the royal families of England. Yeah, another character that needs to be looked into is the bizarre Kenneth Unger. He's still around. He was one of the scions of the satanic Dionysian underworld, and was positioned very much in the center of the San Francisco youth culture, basically to infect them with this satanic Luciferian imagery, to seduce the kids. And in fact, remember I told you last time we spoke about the fact that Timothy Leary and his little cohorts appeared right in the middle of the Chelsea set. They seduced not only the bands, but also the record producers who they knew would be famous later on.